Welcome to No Need to Argue, a podcast where we explore the truth as some see it. No Need to Argue is presented in seasons and looks at one topic over the course of 8 episodes. At No Need to Argue, we believe that knowledge stems from discussion, where the aim is not victory of one side, but progress in thought for all. My name is Ashley Schlafly, one of your 2 co-hosts that's been with you throughout the season so far, and tonight we are going to reach the halfway point of our season. This episode's going to be a little bit different only because we recorded this episode differently than we did our others. But before we get into that, I want to give a second to recognize my co-host, my husband, Tom Schlafly.
Hi, Ashley.
So like I said, this week is going to be a little bit different in the sense that we are not recording our full episode right now. We've already recorded it, and instead we're doing a bit of an intro to it because this week we are talking about eating disorders. We are kind of turning the tables this week, and we are going to be talking about my story and my background with my eating disorder. But when it came time to record this episode, I got really, really nervous. And Tom, how did you feel about that?
I felt validated.
Validated. That's interesting. Do you wanna maybe expound upon that?
Well, you had asked me why I was so nervous, and then I saw that you were nervous, and it was apparent that talking about this stuff makes people nervous.
Right, and rightfully so. And I actually had a lot of sympathy and empathy for you for what we've done so far this season because of having to kind of flip that and talk about my own issues. But we thought it was really, really important for us to do that, to not just tell one side of our story, addiction, but to tell both sides of our story, which also includes the things that are very much wrong with me. And, you know, there's something that you say repeatedly in our relationship, which is that both of us are really, really fucked up. And I'm not sure that that has come across so far in the episodes we've recorded.
No, I'm looking forward to it coming across.
That sounds really terrible. You want people to know how fucked up I am.
Well, everybody knows how fucked up I am. I mean, fuck.
Right. I mean, it's tit for tat, right? And that is kind of where we're going to find ourselves this evening. It was really important to us to follow up last week's episode on socially acceptable drugs with this episode about eating disorders because of the fact that last week we talked about how some substances are stigmatized, but this week we're going to be turning to how even recovery from some substances or recovery from certain addictions or certain compulsions is also treated differently. And that is where we find ourselves comparing Tom's drug addiction and my eating disorder recovery. Tom, do you want to talk a little bit about what you've experienced with how those 2 recoveries are kind of approached and valued differently?
I only know what I've experienced with you. I haven't had a lot of exposure to people who've suffered from eating disorders. I've always felt that they're pretty similar, except that drug addiction it's very tangible, whereas eating disorders, they can be hidden, maybe, or they're in the shadows, it seems. I had a very good friend, one of my best friends, who he died, I think, in 2013 of a heroin overdose, and his sister had a struggle with an eating disorder, and just the way his family approached both was striking and ironic to me, even though they're both very serious conditions. It's stigmatized differently, but I don't know if eating disorders are the prevalence of them. I don't know if they're really publicized as much, and that may be to the detriment of some people who are suffering from these disorders. When I met you, I didn't know very much about eating disorders. I considered it an addiction of sorts, but I didn't really know what it was like to be somebody who suffered from an eating disorder.
Right. And I don't think a lot of people do, which is why one of the other reasons we wanted to do this episode. Tonight, we will be playing a conversation that Tom and I had about a week ago regarding my eating disorder and regarding kind of my story, if you will, that kind of walks through the nexus of it and walks through a pretty decent comparison to the behaviors that I exhibited and still exhibit to this day in recovery for my eating disorder with Tom's behaviors when he was both in active addiction and in recovery from his drug addiction. And the reason that we are doing this intro the way that we are is we talked a second ago about how nervous I was. Tom, you've spent a lot of time in meetings over your lifetime sharing these things. You outwardly share everything about your drug addiction. You're so open with it. But my eating disorder is not something I have discussed as much, not because I'm ashamed of it, but because it makes me feel very, very crazy. And so I got very nervous, and you did something great, which was you said, if you feel like you can talk about it right now, let's just record it. And so that's what we did. We didn't do it in the same formal setup like we've been doing our other episodes. We, during our children's nap time, kind of set up the microphone, and the microphone was closest to me, and we just had a conversation. And I think that it went very well. Is there anything that you want to say to everyone out there before we play this for them?
Just so that I think I've been conditioned to talk about it more openly by going to, probably thousands of 12-step meetings. So it comes probably easier to me. I still know that the anxiety that comes, because I still worry about my job and things like that. So I know the anxiety talking about it creates, but I think there's a lot of people out there who need to hear what you have to say. And I think you're very brave to share your story. It's never easy to share very intimate details about your personal life. I'm proud of you for doing it.
Well, thank you. Well, hopefully it reaches somebody out there, and we're now going to turn this episode over to the conversation that you and I had, and we hope that all of you guys enjoy it.
I learned about your issues with food restriction early on. It really, I think, helped us develop a sort of kinship, I guess. There's been some differences between my addiction and your issues surrounding food. I guess I hope we can get into that tonight.
I think the first thing that I want to make sure is very clear before we begin is that for a lot of people who don't have much experience with eating disorders are like drug addiction. They're a very nuanced thing. There are things that connect all people with eating disorders, and there are things that are very different. Everybody's eating disorder experience is very different. They are all disorders that begin with a feeling of a loss of control. That's where most eating disorders stem from, is a feeling of being out of control. And I am not unique in that way, that my eating disorder manifested itself after a time period of my feeling immensely out of control. When I was 14 years old, I became incredibly ill. The doctors had absolutely no idea what was wrong with me. And doctors at the children's hospital that my parents took me to in New Orleans really were just baffled by what was going on with me, because I had zero energy. They first diagnosed me with mono, and then they tried to diagnose me with mono again. And they thought I may have mono and leukemia. They just genuinely had no idea what was wrong. After many months of testing, what they finally determined is that I had Graves' disease. And Graves' disease basically is a thyroid issue. It's a thyroid disorder where your thyroid is incredibly overactive. And so your body attacks, it's an autoimmune disorder, and it attacks your thyroid like it is a foreign body. Your thyroid produces incredibly high doses of thyroid hormone, which then in and of itself causes your entire endocrine system to just go haywire. So my metabolism was incredibly high when I was 14. My heart rate was really fast, and then all of a sudden it makes you very sick. You have this period of extreme excess of energy, and then it just drops out. And the way that the doctor treats Graves. They put you in two medications. They put you on a medication called Tapazole, and they put you on a medication called Synthroid. And the Synthroid gives you a normal dose of thyroid hormone, and the Tapazole completely stops your thyroid from producing anything. And the biggest side effect of this medication combination is that it totally causes your metabolism to come to a halt. And I gained 40 pounds over about 3 to 6 months. A lot of you out there don't know what I look like, but I'm only 5'2". I'm really, really short. And 10 pounds on me looks like 40 pounds. And so 40 pounds on me look like a whole lot of weight. It made me feel totally and completely out of control.
I was homeschooled through 7th grade, and just like you said, just probably like every other teenager feels, I know the insecurities that we have at 14. So what did that affect, that those medications, what did it have on you?
Well, I mean, it made me feel horrible. And I've made fun of myself before on the show about how I wasn't an overtly cool 14-year-old. I used to wear like Tower of Terror t-shirts from Disney World to school.
What 14-year-old is cool?
There were cool 14-year-olds. I was just never cool. Well, no, they're tools, and they're tools when you grow up. But at the time, the hierarchy of high school makes those people seem cool.
I know. At 14, it all seems very important.
It seems, it's the only thing that's important. And I mean, it's probably a super cliche story, but I started getting bullied horribly as a result of gaining that weight. I already was not very popular because I'm an academic now, but I was a nerd back then, and it wasn't cool to be a nerd in the late 90s like it is today. Geek culture was not something that was thought to be cool. And so I already was made fun of for being in gifted classes and accelerated classes. But I also played, Dungeons and Dragons, and I made myself a huge target in high school culture before I was the fat target in high school culture.
I just had a quick question, just an aside. I read this article that bullying, it certainly happens online, but inside schools today, that students are maybe more receptive to not being bullies. Do you think that bullying happens less? I think it's just switched to being online.
Do I think that bullying happens less? I think that back in the late 90s, when you and I were in high school, through the early 2000s, I think that teachers didn't have the same focus on bullying. I'm sure people did commit suicide because of bullying, but without the advent of online bullying, it was at least contained to the school building in a lot of ways, because you couldn't go home and still be bullied unless you had a horrible home situation, right? But yeah, I mean, I think that schools have done a really good job of stopping bullying in many ways. It still happens far too often, but I think that we just didn't talk about those things yet in the late 90s. And bullying was just something I think that people, there was that culture in the 90s and in the 80s where it was like, well, it's going to toughen you up and it's going to make you be whatever you're going to be and you're going to be better for it. I think that was a lot of what it was. And a lot of the bullying that I experienced, teachers knew about, they heard them, and teachers don't do that anymore because their jobs would be in jeopardy.
Right. I guess that's what I was wondering, whether there's a bigger focus on bullying today. Even if it's just as prevalent, there's more of a emphasis on stopping the bullying. And for me, in high school, I was just ignored, and I would much prefer that, I'm sure, to being bullied. But for you, I think you experienced a lot more bullying.
Direct bullying, yeah. I mean, so kids are cruel, but yet clever, right? And so you know how pale I am. I'm like a shade from death. I mean, I've always been very vampire chic. And again, another thing in high school that wasn't cool. And so because I gained all that weight, the kids started calling me Moby Dick. So none of them had read Melville, but they at least knew what Moby Dick was. And that's what they started calling me all across the school. And it was horrible. My dance group that I was a part of was my life. All I cared about was school and dance. And I loved to dance, and I was a very, very good dancer. But my Graves' disease, it causes a breakdown in your muscles. And so for about a year, my dance ability went extremely downhill. I had to basically retrain my muscles. And So I wasn't very good for a while there. So that was another thing that the girls in that organization could make fun of me for.
That was your sophomore?
My freshman year.
Your freshman.
And it was another thing that they could make fun of me for. But my coach, she weighed us weekly. And so every Friday, we had to get on a scale in front of everyone. It was in the football locker room. And she would tell us what our weight was. And if you gained 5 pounds, you were put on probation. And if you gained more than that or didn't lose it by the next week, you were, you basically couldn't perform. And
you've told me that before, and that's always sound so fucked up to me. Do you think that happens nowadays?
I don't. I don't. And I think that that's a positive thing. But, we had another group that we were very competitive with. And like that group only bought one size uniform. If you couldn't fit in the uniform that they bought, you couldn't be on the team. I mean, that was the way it was. Again, late 90s. I mean, people just didn't, 2020 is still fucked up in lots of ways, but I think we're at least a bit kinder to one another and at least more aware of these things now. And they weren't, it was accepted. It was part of, and my parents knew it happened. They talked about it at the parent meeting when I made the team, when I decided to join it, but they, I don't know if they were okay with it necessarily, but they at least didn't see enough of a problem with it for me to not be a part of an organization that did that.
Yeah, that whole the idea of weighing a high school student to determine whether they can remain on a dance team just seems totally fucked up to me. Maybe I don't know if maybe it wouldn't have seemed as fucked up to me in the late 90s. I don't think I ever put any thought into that, but right now, today, that seems as fucked up to me as how some drug addicts are treated. I mean, it's totally, to me, that seems totally fucked up. I don't know who would do that.
It wasn't a lot of fun. I was fine with it when I made weight, but I wasn't fine with it otherwise. And I do remember another teacher mentioning something about it, and they talked about how wrong they thought it was. And another teacher was like, well, it's the same like for wrestlers, right? They have to make weight. That was the comparison. And I think that a lot of people assumed it was something very similar to that.
And when you use the phrase make weight, that did remind me of wrestling. My father was a wrestler, so, he had to make weight. He, wrapped himself in trash bags and put himself in the sauna to, make weight. It's a very interesting comparison, but I think that the difference is when you're 14 and there's societal pressures on a particular class, like, or gender. I mean, those men had to make weight in order to compete. They didn't necessarily develop the obsessive compulsive disorders that are much more prevalent in women.
Well, I mean, statistically, eating disorders develop most often between the ages of 12 to 25. And so that, there's a huge range there that includes puberty, right? That, right. When people's bodies start to change. But I remember my coach, my dance coach, she knew what was going on with me health wise. And, I wasn't put on probation or anything like that because I had gained the weight, because I had a medical reason for it. But she made very clear to say in front of everyone that if I wanted to walk the track with her after school, I could. I became a target. What began to happen was, we would be weighed in. It was toward the end of the day, and I had one last class after that. And because we were all let go for a period for dance, and we were all together. And then I had 4 girls in that last class with me that were also on the team with me. And these happened to be 4 of those cool people. People had decided they were cool. And they started weekly, every Friday, writing what my weight was on the board. They kept a tally of what my weight was. And so I walk into class every day, and my weight would be on the board. It would say Moby Dick's weight, and then it would be my weight. And the teacher let them do it. I mean, she was sitting there at her desk. She knew they were doing it. I would just go sit at my desk, and, I never cried in front of them. I was never going to do that. Even at that age, I wasn't going to give them the pleasure of letting them see how upset I was. But, the teacher would laugh along with them, and it was a thing, and they kept a tally chart, and everybody then after school would come and tell me how fat I was. That is when I decided that nobody was helping me. I told my mom that I was being, I don't think I used the word bullied, but that people were being mean to me. And my mom is a good mom, but I'm a very dramatic person, so I don't know if she really understood how bad it was. Teachers were participating, and my dance coach was making clear that I needed to lose weight, and I felt so out of control. So I stopped taking my medicine. I stopped taking my Tapazole for a while because I thought first that that would be a way to handle it. Then I was forced to start taking my medicine again because my levels started getting all fucked when I began to look at food as a solution. Let me make very clear, there is a fine line for a person like me between a diet and a disorder, right? I did not set out to become an anorexic. I set out to diet, and that diet spiraled very quickly out of control into what became a really intense journey that I would begin at starting at I was 15 by that point, starting at the age of 15, that I'm 36 now, that I still 21 years later am trying to navigate.
I don't think I was bullied to the extent that you seem to have been, but I was ignored. I really find it interesting how both of us developed compulsions that manifested itself in different ways. We were both really hurt as teenagers, emotionally affected severely. I felt very lonely and angry for years before I ever picked up a drug. And you were bullied and felt insecure but by these external factors that neither of us really had much control over as a 14, 15-year-old. I mean, we don't have much control over our lives. And some people seem to develop compulsions that they use to help them, in a sense, get through these times. You felt insecure, or you felt a pressure to lose weight. You felt these external factors pushing on you. So what did you do about it behaviorally?
I genuinely started out by trying to diet. I got Slim Fast bars, very 90s. I went with a Slim Fast bar. And, I don't know if you know anything about Slim Fast bars, but you were supposed to eat 2 bars, one for breakfast, one for lunch, and then a sensible dinner. And on the TV commercials, it was always like a salad with a piece of grilled chicken.
Right. I do remember the commercials. Right. I do remember those.
And there were bars or shakes. I tried the shakes, but I was so hungry that I went to the bars. I lost about, 5 or 6 pounds over 2 weeks. And I was so excited by that. I said, great. Well, I'm going to eat 3 bars a day. Because why eat a sensible dinner if I'm losing weight from these bars?
That makes sense. Yeah.
Well, and then that transitioned into, when I drink water, I feel more full. And so I began to wean myself to eating only 2 Slim Fast bars a day. And I would take a bite and drink a whole glass of water. And then throughout the day, I would take another bite of one of the 2 bars and drink a whole glass of water.
All right, that makes sense to me too.
Yeah. And so normal people don't do that. When I found success with the Slim Fast bars, I was like, okay, I wanted to know everything I could. What else could I do to lose weight? And so I mentioned on the 3rd episode about my friend that introduced me to smoking. She had an incredibly severe eating disorder. She was bulimic. And I suppose we should talk about the differences between the different types of eating disorders. Anorexia nervosa is a type of eating disorder that is characterized by a couple of things. Food restriction. It is the eating disorder where you restrict food. And it is also usually marked by a 15 to 20% weight that is either lost in a rapid succession or is below an ideal healthy weight. Then there is bulimia. Bulimic individuals, they often look very normal. They look like they have normal weight, or sometimes they are overweight, what you would consider to be overweight or have unhealthy BMIs. And people that are bulimic, they purge their food. That's typically marked by a binging and purging cycle. So they binge a whole lot of food and a whole lot of calories in one setting and then purge by throwing up that food or by doing a combination of throwing up and using laxatives to rid themselves of that food.
There's a sort of a hierarchy in the drug addict world where, alcoholics consider themselves better than IV users, and so on and so on. Is there the same sort of hierarchy in terms of socially accepted responsibility among people with eating disorders?
So that's a tricky question. Hierarchy, I think, may be the wrong word, but yes, there's definitely judgment between the two groups. I mean, I can tell you myself, I suffered from a non-specific eating disorder is what the official term is, which basically means that I was mostly anorexic, but I periodically used bulimic tendencies. So I never binged, but I would purge. I very much was an exercise bulimic. I exercised to the point of physical exertion beyond what is the healthy limit.
I'm sorry, what's an exercise bulimic?
Exercise bulimia is a process where an individual uses exercise in an unhealthy way to keep themselves in a compulsive way to either lose weight or keep themselves in an unhealthy underweight. So I suffered from exercise bulimia in the sense that I would go and work out for 2 and 3 hours and then in the evening go out and work out again for 2 and 3 hours. I was intentionally burning well over more calories than I was taking in.
At the rehab I went to in 2010, they had a women's center, and they kept the men and women separate, probably for good reasons. The women, I think, were mostly there for eating disorders, and they would use chemicals to lower their appetite, but they were restricted on exercising. So they would go to the YMCA, and they were restricted to, say, 20 minutes on the treadmill. Where does I guess you use the phrase exercise bulimia, but what's the bulimic part of that?
You're purging your body through sweat rather than through throwing up.
I only ask that because I have vivid memories of these counselors practically dragging these women off the treadmills.
They pull them off the treadmills on purpose because I have seen people, work out to the point that they pass out because they're so exhausted. Now, at the time I'm talking about, though, I wasn't yet doing that. I didn't have to because I was dancing so much and I was, exercising in order to condition for dancing and then actually dancing, which, I talked about how I became obsessed with the Slim Fast bars. Well, I went to that friend I talked about in that episode that introduced me to cigarettes, and she taught me lots of things like how to blow up marshmallows in the microwave so that one marshmallow becomes much larger. She taught me about the grapefruit diet and how I could lose weight by eating grapefruits and boiled eggs. She taught me all about calories versus fat, about fiber, so that I would use the bathroom more. And when I got a car, I started using laxatives because that's what she told me I needed to do. My best friend became a measuring tape. I had a little notebook like a serial killer where I wrote down all of my measurements and kept track of how often I used the bathroom and how often I peed and how often I ate and the amount of fluids that I drank. The worst part was that as I got thinner, everybody liked me more. People thought I was pretty for the first time because I was thin.
So I really feel that there's a lot of similarities between the behaviors that you and I exhibited. I didn't start using drugs till after college, but my family, I think from the time I was about 20 years old, maybe a year and a half after I started using drugs, they knew something was wrong, but I really feel like, they didn't want to address it because it was uncomfortable. And I'm just wondering, your family's they're probably a lot closer in terms of communication than my family in terms of family dynamics. And did they notice this? Did they address it? Did they try and help you? Did they know what to do?
One thing that you and I have in common is that you have learned through years of therapy that there's a lot of things that for a long time you blamed your family for not noticing or not doing anything about, well, that was not their fault. The same was true for me, because for a very long time I blamed I think it probably landed on my mom most of all. Like, how could you not have known? My family's messy. Like, they're in each other's lives. We're very close. And so it was like, how did they not know that felt a lot of times that I was standing in the room and screaming out loud about how unhappy I was and how much I hated myself, that how could nobody hear because my head was very loud. What was inside my head was incredibly loud, and they acted like everything was fine and that I was perfect. Well, not that I was perfect, but acted like I was doing well. Then I realized how I was a good liar. That's one thing that I understood about you very quickly. Addicts have to be liars because you have to hide what you're doing, and you lie to hide your behavior. When I became somebody that was suffering from an eating disorder, I became a really good liar. It was necessary. And I became very deceptive. And so, like, I remember, but, we would have family gatherings and I would get these little mounds of food and I would push them around on my plate in a very strategic way. The way that you planned out drugs, it was very similar to the way that I planned out the way I would present my food and the way I was eating to my family. So nobody would ask me any questions. They did notice some things. I mean, they made fun of me. They thought that the way that I ate was weird. They talked about, I think it's so funny because your dad talks about your drug problem. I remember my family talking about my food issues, right? Like that's the language that they use.
I think our parents glossed over things in the same way. They realized that we had what they would call an issue, quote unquote. I think on some subconscious level, they realized the severity of it. They were ready to deal with it. I don't know about your parents, but I know my parents were not ready to deal with it. Eating disorders can be very deadly, right?
Well, they can. Generally, people that die from anorexia die from heart failure because their hearts give out. People with eating disorders, we have problems with potassium. That's why when you were in heart failure and the doctor came back and talked about your potassium, I knew so much about your potassium level and what effect it could be having on your heart and your electrolytes, because I studied all of that. I mean, I studied medical textbooks in college to make sure I understood it so I could keep my potassium in balance. I mean, it can be very deadly. I mean, it doesn't kill the amount of people that drug addiction does every year, but there are fewer people with eating disorders than there are people that are drug addicts statistically. I personally believe those numbers are very low. I don't think that the psychiatric community has done a good job really defining the lesser severe eating disorders. I think that there are a lot of people who suffer from eating disorders and don't realize that they do. They think they have just an obsession with dieting, but the way that they think there's a lot of women like at my job or on previous jobs that have talked to me about the way they diet. And I just sit and I think in my head like, ooh, yeah, you're like me. There are people, I think there are more people that suffer from it than seek treatment for it. And there are more people that suffer from it than find themselves spiraling out of control, like people who have really severe eating disorders or do. Maybe it can be deadly, yes.
So it seems like for the eating disorders you're talking about, they're not all skeleton-looking people. And it seems like some people struggle with these compulsions, but don't end up 100 pounds in the hospital dying of heart failure.
Well, it's like I just said, people that are bulimic. I mean, bulimia is clinically marked by individuals who are of normal weight or overweight. And, when you talk about my family, it wasn't really even physical that they noticed. It was behaviorally that they should have noticed. Because by the time I was 17, my food anxiety was in full force. And that, when I think back and I've thought back in therapy and talked in therapy, there are anecdotes about my food anxiety where my family knew something was off. They just thought I was crazy. But, most people with eating disorders have trigger foods that just completely throw us. And for me, it's pizza and mayonnaise. And I remember being a teenager and going out to dinner and like a restaurant would accidentally leave mayonnaise on my sandwich. And I knew it was a situation where I was going to have to eat the sandwich. And I mean, I would go to pieces. I either would start crying or I would go into an absolute rage.
And did you explain to your parents why you were so upset?
At the time, no.
Yeah, at the time.
Oh, God, no.
I mean,
perhaps with my parents, I think they thought that I was suffering from anxiety, depression.
Yeah, they just thought I was being a bitch. They thought I was being a bitch because I would be. I would get just absolutely enraged. And
talking about mayonnaise, I find it so interesting because from my perspective, it's like, just scrape it off. But when you talk about it causing you a panic attack, that makes sense to me because I know the anxiety I feel about other things. And so when you talk about this, it makes sense to me. I would imagine it may not make a lot of sense to people who've never struggled with these sorts of things.
Oh, absolutely. And I feel because most people haven't, like, I feel crazy. Like for so much of my life, I don't think people understand the effect that food has on somebody like me, somebody with an eating disorder. I mean, food is such a massive trigger for my anxiety. It can cause me to have a horrible panic attack. It's prevented me from enjoying a lot of things. Like, we talk about a high functioning addict and how unless you're using heroin, you're a high functioning addict.
I've been able to keep a job, yes.
Right. That's what I mean. And for me, I guess you could say I was a high functioning individual with an eating disorder for a very long time. And then I totally spiraled out of control in college. I had a guy tell me that he pinched my skin, like on my side, because I was not fat at all. I mean, I was very, very thin. And so he pinched my skin, and he was like, "Oh, look at that." He's like, "I guess you need to work out more." Even though he was joking, I completely spiraled out of control after that.
Now, do you think it was because, obviously that's fucked up, that guy shouldn't have done that. Do you think he had a choice then to restrict, or
like how you talk about how addicts have a choice?
Right. If a drug user's clean for a while and it's typically considered a choice to go back and restrict, do you feel like, even though you had that bad thing happen to you, do you feel like you chose to do that?
Yeah, sure, of course. I mean, I had agency. Yeah, I had agency, but I don't think at the time I felt like I did.
Right.
I know now, sure, of course I did. I could have done lots of things that would have been healthier than just completely spiraling out of control. But at the time, no, it didn't feel like I did.
Right. And I think that's the parallel I want to draw to is yes, we have a choice, but at the time we don't feel like we do. And so we make mistakes.
Yeah. And I made lots of mistakes after that. That's when, we talked on episode 1 how I got into Adipex, the diet drug. That's when I started attending multiple clinics to get put on Adipex so that I could abuse the Adipex.
You doctor shopped.
I did. I very much doctor shopped, and they gave me 2-3 times what they were supposed to give me. I would make excuses. You're laughing right now, I feel like, because, I've always been able to get drugs from doctors.
I know, it's very annoying. That is like classic addict behavior. I mean, lying, manipulating, everything you've talked about, and denial we can add. You can see that some people are in denial about overeating or undereating. Like the sort of addict behavior is not limited to drugs.
No, not at all. I mean, not at all. And that type of manipulative behavior served me very well. I mean, I was like a baby manipulator in high school. And when I was in college, I became a master manipulator. I figured out how to control not just food, but everybody around me in relationship to my food.
So how did you stop then?
Well, I got help. I started dating a guy. I mean, I dated lots of other people other than you, but I would say my only other really...
Yeah, they were all dicks.
Well, they were really good-looking dicks. I mean, at the time, that's what I cared about.
Dicks.
Well, both
good-looking dicks.
I mean,
were they?
Well, I mean, I don't think dicks in general are very good-looking. No offense to the men out there, but they were. I mean, that's what I cared about at the time, because I became obsessed with aesthetics in both myself and others. I became very narcissistic, and
they were all short though. Not the dicks, the people.
Well, the dicks too for a lot of them. If we're going to get honest here, but But yes, they were shorter than you. And I did that as a way, because I was so insecure. I became obsessed with myself, like the way that I looked.
Yeah.
I wore really expensive, I bought expensive clothes and wore them. I showed off my body.
But isn't that at the heart of eating disorders?
It is, because that's the thing people don't get, is if you would have seen me, you would have thought that I loved myself, right? That I was really content with myself. But I
saw right through that, but yes.
Yeah, but I remember my first activity when I finally decided to seek treatment. It's a really cliche eating disorder activity, but they had me trace my body on a piece of paper that was on the wall, and then they had me identify problem areas. And I mean, I looked at that thing and I, talked all about the different parts that I wanted to change, the plastic surgeries that I wanted to have done, the liposuction and where I would have it done, because I talked a very good game, but I fucking hated myself. I hated everything about myself. I hated the way I looked. I would lay in bed at night and I had no fat on my stomach, but I would like pull my skin out and then imagine what it would be, how cathartic it would be to like slice the skin off so that it wasn't there anymore. And would it kill me if I did that? I mean, those are the thoughts that I would have at night. I would stay up at night and do that. And I would do that on all different parts of my body. And I remember watching that movie Seven, where the guy has to cut off a part of his body and he's like, oh, it was such a hard choice. I'm like, dude, I was like, I could give you a pound of flesh from multiple parts of my body. It seems like the most like easy fucking thing to do in the world. Give me a tourniquet. Let me figure out how to do it and I'll do it,
I mean, yeah, that's so distorted. That is, a classic addict mindset. I just feel compassion for people who struggle with these mindsets, whether it has to do with food or whether it has to do with drugs or whatever. Like you're trapped in your own head, and it is a nightmare.
Before I started dating my boyfriend, my junior year of college, I hooked up with a bunch of guys because I sought them out as like a way to be fulfilled, as a way to have
a hole.
Well, to fill a hole. Yes, to fill a hole. To fill a hole metaphorically. Yes, I sought out people that were physically beautiful on purpose, because what I wanted to happen was I wanted one of them finally, when they saw me, to tell me how disgusting I was. I wanted them to tell me that.
You wanted them to tell you how disgusting you were?
Because I thought I was disgusting. I was waiting to find somebody that legitimized it. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well,
so I would hook up.
That makes sense, because I think you've tried to do that with me before.
I'm sure I have. I've done it with everybody I've ever been with.
Right. So I know what you're talking about. And, when you explain it, it makes sense to me because like we said on the very first episode, we talk about self-loathing. It's all about self-loathing. It's not about what you do, the behavior. Like it's all very similar. So that's why I think we understand each other. I just wonder sometimes, like, I know you still struggle with the thoughts in your head every day, right? To this day.
I do. And I mean, what you're talking about, how I do it with you, I play out those patterns. I play them out. I mean, I remember when you and I had first started dating, there was one night I had gotten out of the shower and I was getting dressed in your bedroom. We were living separately. I mean, we weren't living together yet. And we've been dating a couple of months, and you said to me, you're so beautiful. And I panicked and I started berating you and like, why would you say that to me about how you shouldn't think those things about me? And you said back to me, why are you trying to convince me of something that I believe? Why are you trying to convince me otherwise? I left your house. I mean, I had class, but I left quicker than I needed to. A lot of the people I dated on purpose because I wanted them to emotionally beat me up the way I was beating myself up in my head. And you were the first person who refused to do that. And it was so disarming and it was so disconcerting. It made me sick to my stomach.
That is so interesting to me. I think that people who don't suffer from, they can just, first of all, they can be really mean. Second of all, they just have no frame of reference. They don't, unless you've studied the stuff, they lack compassion. They're ignorant. And so when I met you and you were really vulnerable with me, it's like, fuck, I know exactly what she's talking about. Like, I totally get it.
Well, and that's why when a lot of people, because I shared in the first episode how a lot of your therapists or people at rehabs have been like, wow, how did you two wind up together? Because we are so different about substances and different in other ways. I mean, we're both very cynical. We're both very dark. We're both many of those things, but we are very different. And the thing that they don't understand is exactly what you just said, is that there's a darkness inside of you that causes you to use. It manifests itself in a drug addiction. For me, there is a darkness inside of me that manifested itself in total body dysmorphia and a raging eating disorder.
Right. What on the show Dexter? What do you call it?
A dark passenger.
Right. And I mean, how many people you think have dark passengers? And it can manifest in many different ways.
Of course it can. Some people, and some people, they deal with it better than you and I have.
Some people have a better coping mechanisms, I think, inherently.
Well, and arguably, I have probably handled my dark passenger better than you have in recent years. But the thing that I want to make sure is very clear is that, like drug addiction, eating disorders are not something that are cured. They never go away. And for me, I suffer from that in a multitude of ways. So eating disorders are inherently an anxiety disorder. And in my 30s, it transitioned from solely being about food to being about health in general. And so it's not just about the health as a result of food, but all types of health issues, like this coronavirus thing that's going on right now. I mean, it scares the fucking shit out of me. There's a reason why zombie movies, I think, are the most frightening things on the planet, because it deals with the loss of control and a disease. I'm terrified of that. And so it manifests itself in a panic disorder. And then the other aspect of it is that my eating disorder has ruined, even though it's not active in the sense that I define active as in I have not restricted my food since I was 22 years old. I have not actively restricted my food. I have not purged since I was 24 years old. But I'm not cured.
Oh, right. And I would agree with you that you have more successfully handled your eating disorder compulsion than I have my drug addiction, in our marriage, because, I have had to go to treatment, for it. And it is, I've used very dangerous things, and you have not restricted your food for many years. But I can tell the mental bandwidth that it takes up for you. And so I know, every time I gotten clean from drugs, like the drugs, when I'm using, they take up mental bandwidth. And when I get clean, I mean, the amount of time still spent fighting it or accepting it or going to meet, it still takes up a ton of mental bandwidth, and I can see it in your head.
Well, I think a perfect example of that is, just two anecdotes. I still have trouble trying on clothes at malls. I hate trying on clothes because I hate my body. Even when my body is in great shape and looks great aesthetically from another person's perspective, I hate it. And I don't want to try on clothes because trying on clothes are all about looking at yourself in the mirror. I hate mirrors. I avoid them. Even to this day, we just ate Wendy's, but this right here will tell you the difference is I can tell you right now, I ate 19 fries. I ate 4 nuggets. And I could tell you the exact calorie count, the exact sodium count, and the exact fat count in that. And I have already computed what that means for the rest of the day so I can make sure that I remain healthy. That right there shows you that dark passenger may be pushed down. My own identity that is not my eating disorder may be stronger than it, but it is there. And it's ruined moments for us.
It has ruined quite a few date nights, probably.
Our wedding. I mean,
our wedding. That's a great example.
Well, you weren't a part of that because you weren't there, but I
heard about it though.
I mean, I had an absolute panic attack when they put my dress on me because I hated the way I looked in it. And everybody was going to be looking at me. There's this misconception in my family that I like to be the center of attention. In a lot of ways, I guess that may be true in the sense that I have a very big personality, right? Like I'm loud, I'm funny. I'm a big presence in a room, I guess, metaphorically speaking. But I don't love to be the center of attention in the way that they think. I mean, our wedding, I'm supposed to be the center of attention.
I think what you're speaking to is the insecurity that anybody struggling from obsessive compulsive disorder feels about themselves. So even if you're highly extroverted, like you still, at least regarding this, are insecure.
I am. And you're supposed to be the most beautiful you ever are on your wedding day, which I think is bullshit. But like, that's what society tells you, right? I knew everybody was going to be looking at me and expecting me to look good. That made me really nervous. I mean, our pregnancies, every woman hates their body when they're pregnant at some point. You know, you said something so gross to me when I was pregnant with
What?
Ellie, because you were like looking at me and you're like, I just love when you're pregnant because there's more of you to love. And I was like, oh my God.
I don't think
You
I said
did
that
say
phrase.
that. And it was
I was
horrible.
highly attracted to you when you were pregnant.
Oh,
and you did not understand it. I don't think I used that phrase. I really don't. I was more attracted to you when you were 8 months pregnant than, on our wedding day.
Well, and see, like that right there, my heart, like I just had a palpitation because that right there, just, I will think about what you just said. Because you just said it should be a compliment, right? Because you just said it was more attractive to you in 8 months pregnant than your wedding day. So like, I will process that statement and break that statement down and overanalyze it for probably weeks now. That's what I will do because you talked to me one time because I told you that I gained 26 pounds when I was pregnant and you're supposed to gain weight when you're pregnant. You told me, well, that's okay. I've never liked thin women because your other girlfriends I'm not the body type of the women you typically dated women with like big boobs and big butts and that were slightly overweight. And then we met and I didn't have a big butt and I wasn't overweight and I was short and they were all tall. And so already I had processed through all of that. And then you made that statement to me and I was like, oh God, like, am I going to have to be fat now, for him to like me, for him to want to be with me? And it messed me up because that's what people with eating disorders do. I don't restrict my food, but the thought processes are still there.
But I guess, so what you're saying to me sounds illogical because I consider myself a fairly logical person. On the other hand, I know about addiction and compulsions. So on the other hand, it makes complete sense when you say, I thought about that for months. It sounds like you're obsessing. I also totally get it.
It does sound crazy. And I'm probably, I think everybody's a little bit crazy. Everybody's a little bit fucked up. So sure, I am those things, but it's just the way I think. And I've had lots of victories. I don't weigh myself every day anymore, which was a huge victory for me.
Measure yourself every day.
I don't, until we had Finn. I kept that notebook underneath our bathroom sink with all of my measurements in it. No, I didn't measure myself as often as I did when I was restricting my food, but I measured myself once a month.
Right. I know you kept a tape measure.
Yeah. And it was like a drug. I would get giddy on the day that it finally arrived that I could measure myself again. I cannot, if I ever needed to lose a significant amount of weight, I would have a very hard time using a lot of the programs that are out there like Noom, like Weight Watchers that require you to track food. Because for me, that's very quickly going to spiral out of control if I have to track food in that way. And so I have to think about it more holistically than I can actually counting calories or I can counting carbs. I have even really, I've been talking to my therapist weekly about, and I haven't shared this with you, about how difficult it's been having to count sodium with you.
Yeah. So about the sodium, so what does your therapist say? How do you, is it just like a general eat healthy, sort of thing? Because counting stuff triggers you. How do you?
Well, it can trigger me.
It can trigger
It hasn't triggered me yet. And it's just about being aware. It's like with anything with you. I very much liken it to when you talked about how when I drink, it doesn't trigger you. So you're able to be around me in certain situations when I'm drinking. It's the same for me.
Yeah, if you're not drunk. Yeah.
Right. I have to be aware of those things. And I hope I've made it clear in talking and letting my crazy flag fly free in this episode that the way that I process food is not at all dissimilar to the way that you use drugs.
Right. And I really don't think you're that crazy. I don't think you're crazier than anybody else.
Well, but the problem though is you're as crazy as I am. So are we just those two people in like the insane asylum that are legitimizing each other?
There's a lot of crazy people. Everybody's crazy.
At the end of the day, the most important thing for all of us that suffer from these issues is to share about them. And, you knew how nervous I was to share about this because I don't like talking about it. I feel incredibly crazy when I talk about it. But like you, I may feel nervous, but I'm not ashamed about it. I'm not ashamed about any of it. Hopefully, as much as you've been able, while there's less of us out there, hopefully two things happened as a result of this episode. That one, it helped somebody or at least made them feel legitimized. And then the other side of that is to educate people because, again, we've called this show No Need to Argue because we believe in creating a conversation. And there are people who are suffering from eating disorders, and there are people who are suffering from other types of process addictions and from drug addictions. And one thing that we all share is that we feel isolated and we feel alone. I've never felt more alone than when I'm trapped in my head. Isolation is only broken by feeling like you're a part of a community. And so hopefully those of you that are a part of my community, I salute you. I wish you well. And hopefully those of you that aren't, at least maybe have a little bit more compassion.
No, actually, this was very informative. I think I said we focused a lot on my addiction over the years. It's probably my fault, but I haven't talked to you much and I haven't educated myself as much on your struggles with food. They've come up, but I am sensitive to them and I'm aware of them, can totally empathize with them. But I just think that, I haven't maybe asked you enough over the years about what's been going on in your head.
Well, I haven't wanted to tell you probably, so it's fine. I'm just glad to have shared and, I'll deal with the anxiety about people knowing so much about me later.
I really think that this helps people. Lots of people struggle with this. I know that they do. Not everybody is a drug addict, but they struggle with some of these things that when you talk about it, I totally get. So thank you for sharing your story and talking about this issue.
Yeah. So that's going to wrap up another episode here at No Need to Argue. We want to thank you for you spending a little bit of time with us and getting to have a bit of this conversation alongside us. As always, please follow us on Twitter at @NoNeedPod or our personal Twitters, which are at Ashley Schlafly or at Tom_Schlafly. We also appreciate all of the emails and comments that we've been getting in. So if you would like to reach out to us with your story, questions, concerns, or comments, please feel free to do so at noneedpod@gmail.com. And we ask that you hit the subscribe button on whatever podcast app you are listening to so that you can make sure to stay up to date with all future episodes. We also would ask that if you haven't done so yet, to please leave us a 5-star review. It is how we help our podcast audience grow and how we get a little bit higher in those search results so we can find new listeners. Until next time, we want to thank you for joining us here at No Need to Argue.